to the next slide, then I can give a little bit more details about the heat pump. Maybe this goes into too much detail or too little detail, but the heat pump, the idea is that the source of how you're going to run your heating is not gas. That, of course, has an immediate combustion with that CO2 emission. But we electrify the heating, which, of course, doesn't have an emission in the household. But, of course, still some of the electricity that we're using it for comes from gas-fired plants. And the heat pump is not your typical electric heater that you have in your home, where how you make tea, or maybe you have infrared heating underneath your desk to make it a little warmer. The heat pump does something different. It actually doesn't generate heat just from heating up something via electricity, but it moves heat from the outside to the inside. And the best example, I think, that I've always found is the fridge, where everybody already has a heat pump in their household. That's the fridge that moves heat from the inside of the fridge to the outside to your room, so it gets a little warmer in the room and, of course, colder inside the fridge. And the heat pump does exactly the opposite. It moves energy or heat from the outside air and moves it inside, so your water and your radiators are hot and makes the air outside a little cooler. And since it moves heat and doesn't generate heat per se, it is much more efficient than your normal electric immersion, between 3 and 4.5 times more efficient than that. And that, of course, really, really helps with energy consumption, because we're not using that much energy. But it also helps, of course, to run it economically, because as we all know, electricity is a little, or is more expensive than gas. So we have to be way more efficient in the boiler to make it worth your while investing in the heat pump to make the running costs comparable or even cheaper than a gas boiler. So that's the idea behind the heat pump. If we go to the next slide, John, then the UK government is very much behind the rollout of heat pumps. And at the moment, we had 60,000 heat pumps sold in the UK in 2022. The market is growing, so it's really good to be in heat pumps right now, but it needs to be much better, because we want to get to 600,000 installations by the end of 2028. So a 10x upscale of the market, which of course is very, very ambitious, but needs to be done in order to get the UK off gas and reduce the carbon emissions. In the international context, if we go to the next slide, heat pumps are way more popular in other countries. And there's it is very noticeable, like if you're going to Germany, if you're going to the Netherlands, or even if you're going to Sweden, the penetration of heat pumps all across those nations are much higher. And there's, of course, a few reasons for that. In the Nordic countries, it is that they had very cheap electricity forever. So the heat pumps typically actually just were competing with direct electric heating, which is a very easy calculation to make, because it's just much more efficient. And often they don't actually have a gas grid, so that makes a big difference. But for example, if we compare the UK to the Netherlands, and I'll make that point in a second, then we really see that a country that's quite comparable to the UK has a much higher penetration of heat pumps than what we have here in the UK. So if we go to the next slide, John. So when you see that kind of stat in terms of just a very low uptake of heat pumps in the UK, I think it's always worth asking the question why, and why are the Brits so much behind when it comes to the heat pump rollout. And I think for me, what I've always learned speaking to homeowners like yours, is you really have to, at the end, think about how the homeowner makes that decision, because the homeowner ultimately has to write the check to pay for the heat pump, right? Even with subsidies or not, of course, there's a cost involved. And if we go into the consumer perspective on the next slide, hopefully you guys do kind of recognize yourselves in that kind of how you think about heating. And I think there's typically 4 things that customers want out of the heating system. Number one, and by far the number one, is reliability, right? Like having a warm home is a fundamental need. You don't want to make any compromises on that. If it's cold, it needs to be warm. If it's mild, it needs to be warm. I don't want to compromise on that, right? So reliability is number one. Number two is, heating is certainly no luxury good that one on reliability. We installed a lot of heat pumps, and all of them work really well. So if they're correctly designed and installed, you're not going to have any problems with your heating system. But of course, at the moment, there's just so much talk in the news about heat pumps not working and someone is being left alone and so on. So there's just a lot of chat and bad press about them, which of course makes you as a consumer nervous around it, because number one goal is I want to have a reliable heating system. That's number one, right? The second one is a heat pump installation is typically not just a heat source swap. That means that we're taking the boiler out and putting and just swapping the pipes of the heat pump. But of course, it is oftentimes an upgrade to the central heating system as well. We're looking at some radiators, need to do heat loss calculations and so on. So it's definitely a larger upfront invest. And with the price of gas at the moment, people are fearing that if they are going to electricity for heating, that they're actually going to end up with higher electricity bills. And last but not least, if you have a distressed boiler purchase, so if your boiler breaks down, you're standing up in the shower, you've got cold water, the lead times for heat pumps in a company like ours is between 3 and 5 weeks, but I think, John, you shared something about Octopus having 6 or 8 months lead time. That's, of course, not feasible for how many people make decisions in terms of their heating system. Because if the boiler breaks down, I'm going to have to replace the boiler within a very short amount of time. And the way heat pumps work today with the installations, that's just not feasible, right? So that's kind of where we are from a consumer perspective in terms of where we are with the heat pump. So what to do about it is, of course, the question. So if we're going to the next slide, if you're reading the literature about energy transition, there's a couple of things I think to learn. One is it is extremely slow. I've been in the energy technologies for a long time. My first job out of uni was building a company for power grid operators, and I can tell you nothing is fast when it comes to power grids. So something is just always very slow. And an energy transition, of course, also has the word transition in it. So we're not just thinking about we are 90% gas today in the UK, and then we need to be 100% heat pumps and district heating networks in 2040. But there's, of course, quite a time span in between where we need to transition. And that's why it's just so important in a transition to not think about the end and start point, but think about how can we get there and how can we kind of make an incremental step on the way to 100% away from natural gas and foreign gas, of course, as well. And that's where, of course, the hybrid heat pump comes in. So if we're going to the next one. And I do want to pick up that conversation about the Dutch market again. So the Netherlands is actually quite similar to the UK in many things. It has a very high gas penetration. They had, similar to the UK, they found gas, domestic gas in the 60s and 70s, and just built the entire country on a gas grid, similar to the UK. So a lot of abundant and cheap domestic gas available. That's number one, high gas penetration. Very similar climate. The winters are not getting super cold. Mostly mild winters with like the odd -2, -5 day. And of course the housing stock, not just the UK has an old housing stock, but the Netherlands in many ways is actually quite similar. But if you're looking at the penetration in the Netherlands in terms of the heat pumps, it's just way bigger and it's growing faster than the UK. So they have a penetration 7 times higher than the UK. So the question I think that is an important one as we go into the energy transition is what can we learn from others, what it worked. And if we're going to the Dutch market, then we're looking at hybrid heat pumps. That was the big insight that they had. So if we're going to the next slide, hybrid heat pumps for almost 100% of the heat pumps in the Netherlands today are hybrid heat pumps as part of a retrofit. Not on the new builds, but as part of you own a home, you live in one, and you want to get rid or reduce your gas consumption. And the idea about the hybrid is that before, of course, you've got your boiler doing both your space heating needs as well as your domestic hot water needs. So you get your put in taps and showers
could it work for people on combi boilers?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so that's one of the big things for us being a heat pump installer in London is most of the homes that we are in are combi boilers, right? So after you just cleared out the airing cupboards with the hot water tank, you have to put it back in. So in that particular setup here that you can see, the gas fire boiler would maintain the hot water usage and would supplement the heating on the heating circuit side.
Right. So on the heating circuit, a heat pump is capable of feeding the radiators directly. The reason for the hot water tank is for the hot water.
Exactly, yeah.
I never knew that. I thought the hot water tank was an intrinsic requirement of a heat pump system. So that's really interesting.
So it is an intrinsic requirement for a heat pump system if the heat pump needs to should provide the hot water. And just one of the reasons why that is in a combi boiler when your hot water when you have one or two bathrooms and you don't have that many showers at the same time, the gas boiler just with the power of the gas boiler, you've got like 35 kilowatts of heat going into your water. It is very good at just heating up water very, very quickly, so you can have on-demand water. Because the heat pump is not advised to run like that, so you need to have a thermal store of a hot water tank in order to provide that hot water. That's why we have to do the hot water tank. Now, good. So if we're going to the next slide, I'll just walk you through kind of why the hybrid heat pumps are, in my perspective, enabling the low carbon transition. So, in terms of reliability, you've got two heat sources, therefore double the reliability. If you ever go to New York or to the Northeast in the US, that's how most people heat their homes, for example, as well. It is that in the shoulder months, the heat pump does it, or the air conditioning system, and in the super cold spells, it's the furnace that's provided, or the gas boiler. So it's very common that people have two heat sources. A lot of the times in the UK, some people have, of course, wood as a supplementary source. So it's not uncommon that you have two sources. The second one is the cheap to install and operate. The upfront costs are much lower because the amount of work is much lower. One is in a system where the hot water tank is not required, you save a day of labor already, and of course the cost of a hot water tank. That's number one. And the second one is just some of the upgrades that we have to take are not necessary with a hybrid heat pump system. And with it can be a one-day job. It's a very kind of like straightforward installation. And then of course it's easy to install. So no radiator upgrades. It can be added to a new or existing boiler. And the last one is in terms of the environmental impact. Since space heating is by far the majority of the heating load in a house, it's between 80-20% to hot water, and we're taking between 80 and 90% of that just with the boiler. Just with the heat pump. We're getting most of the environmental savings as part of a hybrid heat pump install. So it's the perfect example of perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good, right? It's like we're taking the majority of your CO2 emissions away from your house while giving you a sense of like you already have a heat pump and just getting more heat pumps into homes that people are happy with, which is nice. And then of course from an environmental perspective, we also have the biggest bang for the buck. That means for the investment that I'm taking in terms of adding a heat pump to my existing boiler system, it's a lower cost install with almost the exact same CO2 impact, which of course translates to a much more impactful per pound spent investment that you can take with that hybrid heat pump system. So these are kind of why I'm thinking is why we are convinced that hybrid should certainly be John, you said 30 minutes, and it's been 28, so I've been on my good best behavior.
Yeah, that's extremely good, Christoph. Much appreciated. I'll put you back on screen, as it were, and ask for questions first from Nick.
Okay. So I noticed in the last chart you showed about the cost effectiveness or environmental effectiveness relative to investment. You said pre-government subsidy for the full heat pump. You didn't mention subsidy for the hybrids. Are you not covered by the, what is it called, BUS?
Boiler upgrades, yes, yeah. So one of the big things that we lobby for at the moment is that the hybrid should be included in some way into the government scheme. At the moment, the government scheme is highly restrictive on the heat pump needs to provide 100% of the space heating and hot water load, which means that no boiler is allowed to be available on site. And that means that you at the moment are excluded from the subsidy, which, quite honestly speaking, is for many people is prohibitive of making the hybrid decision. So most of our installations are full heat pump system, just because that 7.5K gap is just so substantial, and nobody says easily no to 7.5 free money from the government.
Thanks.
We had a question from Bill. Have you withdrawn your question, Bill?
No. Do you, as a company, do ground source heat pumps at all?
No. I mean, like from an engineering perspective, I love ground source heat pumps, but my mission is very much providing the biggest bang for the buck in terms of CO2 emission reduction. And ground source heat pumps on that scale have a very bad ratio because it's a very, very substantial investment for not much additional CO2 emission gain.
Yeah, I watched Ken's webinar about their new Qbox NX, and it wasn't accurate. They had this great idea that a grant was taken heat pump, and then the Oxford invested in them.
Yeah.
Legal and general invested in them. And from the webinar, it appeared that you'd be paying £25 a month payment to pay for the drilling for the boreholes. And when I ran them up, it wasn't the case. But
Okay.
I think certainly the hybrid, I always felt hybrid was a way forward. We need the government to include that in the grant.
Thank you, Bill. Question from Peter Statham.
Yes, so you mentioned that you're using it mainly for space heating, and I thought the heat pump was more efficient if the radiators are running cooler. Do you have to consider upgrading all your radiators to get this to work as well as you hope?
No, so you would still run your system, your heating system on a so-called weather compensated curve, which means that the temperature of your radiators is adjusted according to how warm or cold it is outside. And the reason for that is when it's colder, your house loses more heat, so we have to put more heat in. And the best way to do it is just to adjust how hot the radiators are. And the idea behind with the hybrid system is that if it's above 2 degrees, your radiators don't really have to be super hot. But then if it goes below 2 degrees, with the gas boiler, we can get the radiators to a very, very, very hot existing ones, so we don't have to necessarily upgrade them. So that's kind of the idea of like removing all requirement of radiator upgrades, given of course that the boiler at the moment heats your house comfortably. And that's always the first question, or one of the first questions we ask is, if the boiler doesn't do the job today, then of course you're going to have to invest in your heating circuit overall, not just in the adjustment of the heat source, right?
So if the boiler's all right today, you think the air source heat pump can actually be used for the same radiators?
If it's on a hybrid, if the boiler runs at 70 degrees at -2 and it's fine, then you have to have a hybrid system. If you're going to go for full heat pump and the boiler runs very hot all year, then you potentially have to upgrade radiators. So it's again a decision. It's again decision between the hybrid is going to remove some of the upgrade requirements that you have in your home, versus if you're going is a little bit more complicated because you need to make a decision about how efficient you want to run the system.
Can I just add a little bit of information for Peter and Jane, I think it is. We investigated 12 different companies for air source heat pumps, and 2 of them were British Gas and Octopus. British Gas said that all of our 7 radiators would have to be replaced. Octopus said 2 would have to be replaced out of the 7. So there's a lot of conflicting information out there as to how many radiators you may have to have replaced, and quite a lot of it, as far as I can see, depends on the power of the heat pump. Would you say that's true, Christoph?
So, I mean, there's 2 things when it comes to radiator upgrades. One is if there's an imbalance within the house. For example, you've got your kitchen extension with a large window front, so lots of heat loss, and a tiny radiator, and then in your bedroom, and you've got a massive radiator in there. So that kind of imbalance can be addressed by, of course, adjusting some radiators. That's number 1, right? And number 2 is what kind of flow temperature, so how efficient do you want to run your system inside your house. That also determines a little bit how many radiators you need to upgrade. The key thing for us oftentimes is we're doing, of course, a heat loss calculation, and we monitor all of our heat pumps and have a feedback circle with the customer to understand like real empirically driven data in terms of what actually happens versus just us modeling. The core question for us always to ask is like, which rooms are cold in your house? Because typically the homeowner already knows their house the best, and many times also, thermal comfort is very subjective. So just ask the family which rooms are typically colder or warmer. And while we're there, you've got the plumbers on site, you might as well just fix that problem. That's typically the best indicator in terms of what radiators needs to be upgraded.
Thank you. Sal has been waiting for some time. Sal, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah. My boiler was put in 1992, and it was one of the first electric boilers in the country. And it's running perfectly well since then. It was a pretty fantastic thing. If I came to replace it, and obviously this is a question that will have to be done in some detail, but off the top of your head, would it not be possible just to replace the boiler as is? Because I've seen some reports that say you can just replace the boiler with a heat pump system.
So, I mean, unfortunately, I always give the answer of like, it depends a little bit if you're looking at specifically at your house, right? But when I'm looking at all the projects that we've done, I would say it's around 40% or maybe 50% where it's just literally just a heat source swap, right? So we don't do anything in the central heating system. So we don't have to upgrade any radiators and so on. The customers are happy. And then there's, I would say, 30-40% where we have to upgrade 1 to 2 radiators, and that is, people are always worried about it. It's actually just not a big deal at all, because if it's a single radiator, you put a double radiator in. It's like it looks the same, or you hardly notice any difference. It's really not a big deal. And then in every 10th install, I'd say we have to upgrade some pipe work, and then of course we have to lift the floorboards and stuff like that. So that is definitely a little bit more involved, right? But for the most part, it really is not that big of a deal in terms of the actual installation. It takes 3 days.
Okay, Nick, second question from you.
Can you talk a bit about you've explained that in principle the idea of a hybrid as far as space heating goes is that if it gets very cold, the gas boiler takes over.
Yeah.
What is the trigger? How does that work? How is it controllable or set according to temperature? Can you talk us through that?
Yeah. So every heat pump system has a hybrid manager in it, which means that they basically have adjust that. So you know, you can say, you know, if you want to take the family a little bit for a test, so like let's start with -2 and see if someone noticed something, you know, and then you just potentially just gradually increase the alternative point for the heat pump to trigger the boiler. So that would be very easy. There are smarter ways of doing it. Like for example, the trigger point can be dynamic based on the electricity to gas price ratio. So the heat pump compares dynamically what's the efficiency of the heat pump right now, and based on that, is it cheaper to use the gas versus the heat pump, and it just triggers the boiler or not. So that could be, of course, if, you know, a more dynamic way of managing your heating system.
And you offer that, do you?
Yeah, we offer that because we're choosing heat pumps that are capable of doing that. Like for example, the Valent system is in Germany. It's very popular. The hybrid heat pump system. Typically, like all of them have been designed to work like that.
Right, thank you. Bill, your second question.
What temperature does your heat pump work at?
You mean in terms of flow temperature?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're going with an R290 unit, so the newer refrigerant like a Valent unit or a Samsung, that goes up to 70 degrees. 770, yeah.
Good.
And then the R32 one, so that would be, you know, the Daikin Octopus, what Octopus puts in at the moment, the Daikin older units. These are R32s that can go up to 55. The key thing, yeah.
The reason why I'm asking the question because I was there in September in Francourt Road for the launch of the Octopus Cozy 6
Yeah.
heat pump, and that was about 70 degrees because some time ago I knew from Holland that they developed a heat pump that was hotter. But probably heat pumps years ago they weren't hot enough. I'm really pleased to hear your heat pump will be 70 degrees.
But just important one, Bill. I think it is a little bit of a marketing gag, these high temperature heat pumps, because it's one of those things. Is like, while you can do it, you probably shouldn't. So most, like, you know, almost exclusively the customers that we have, we're totally fine keeping the house warm at 55 degrees when it's -2, -3 degrees outside. So you don't have to go that high in terms of temperature. The key change that we always have to do with educating the homeowner is the heat pump doesn't run like the boiler. Because if you are running it like from 6 to 8 a.m. and from 4 to 6 p.m., like just 4 hours a day with the boost, that is why you need high temperature, but it's not the right way of using the heat pump, and just in general, it's not very efficient. If you're doing it slow and steady from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., you do not require high temperature heat pumps.
Next on the question list is Trevor.
Yeah, hi. It was just a couple of points. I was interested to know how the interface worked between the boiler water and the heat pump water. Is it all one open pipework system, or is it got a heat exchanger, or
Yeah.
a header, or what?
So there's two ways of doing it, and it depends a little bit on in terms of how you want to run it. If you want to run the heat pump and the boiler at the same time, so you basically have a dual fuel system, then you need to have what we call a buffer tank. So a buffer tank is where it collects the heat from both the heat pump and the boiler, and then there's just one pipe or two pipes, flow and return, coming out of the buffer to feed the heating circuit. So that's one way of doing it. That is typically what we don't like to do necessarily, just because of course we have to find space for the buffer and it's more cost
will that work also VAT free?
So it's VAT free if we're not putting another boiler in. So like heat pump installations. So if we're adding onto to the boiler system, then it's like any heat pump installation is VAT exempt. Yeah.
We got two more questions, and I think we'll wrap it up after that, if that's all right with you, Christoph.
Of course, yeah.
First of all, Peter.
Yes, I'm just wondering, in an ideal installation, what sort of power factor improvement do you think you get over here? Bearing in mind gas is cheaper than electricity, but what if you ignore that in terms of kilowatt hours per year? What sort of savings do you think you get with the hybrid heat pump?
Yeah. So on the hybrid heat pump system, there's two things. One is just how hot we have to run the heat pump, even in milder weather, right? So if we would say if we're aiming for 50 degrees at -2, for example, then you're typically looking at efficiencies around 3.8 to 4. These are the efficiencies you get out of the hybrid heat pump system. The key thing that I always stress to people is the way you save money with the heat pump is that you compare the efficiency boost you get from the heat pump over the boiler, like how much less energy you have to put in to get the same result. Compare that to the price premium you paid from electricity over gas, right? So there's one good factor and one bad factor, right? And it's much easier to reduce the electricity premium you pay over gas than it is to increase necessarily the heat pump efficiency by a major factor. And the easiest way to do that in terms of bringing down the price premium you pay for electricity is get a small battery. Because the small battery really, really allows you to maximize your off-peak consumption. So you charge up the battery during the off-peak time and then discharge when it's very expensive from the grid. And that's why I'm actually the most excited running a heat pump business in the UK. Because the UK is at the forefront actually internationally in terms of bringing smart meters to homes and allowing people with like the Octopus Agile tariff and so on to participate in those dynamic prices and design their homes accordingly in order to have a lower energy bill. So there's a lot of like fascination with very efficient heat pump systems, which me as an engineer get excited about that too. But I think just from a total cost of ownership perspective, it's much better to spend that extra amount of money on an additional battery than, for example, upgrading 10 more radiators.
So we're talking like a large factor. All the other things, maybe a lot of upfront costs, but they could be quite a large factor in terms of kilowatt hours, whatever the source of power you put into your system.
Exactly. I mean, like with the hybrid system, you cut your gas consumption by around 80%. So that's the amount of kilowatt hours that you of course reduce on your gas consumption. But then of course you're adding some on the electricity side too, but typically only a third or 25% to whatever you used in gas before.
Can I just add something which people may not be aware of, and Christoph will be, is if you live in Sweden, where electricity is roughly the same price as gas, 90% of the houses have heat pumps, because heat pumps are 3 to 4 times more efficient, so therefore 3 to 4 times cheaper than using gas. We in this country have a situation where electricity is something like 3 times the price of gas. But in my view, and I think a lot of other people's view, that has eventually got to change a bit. So heat pumps will get more and more beneficial, because sooner or later the price of gas has got to go up and the price of electricity has got to go down.
I mean, John, if I can just add to that, I completely agree with you. Like one of the biggest factors is the ratio between the gas and electricity price. There are some parts, and there's consultation out from the government at the moment, that a lot of the social and environmental levies, so additional taxes are on electricity versus gas. So there's kind of like an implicit negative carbon price of burning gas. So that one has to change, but it really only takes 6-7 pence of your electricity, which every little
specifications are on what sort of type of electricity tariff you'd recommend, expecting you to say, well, because you have to run heat pumps slow and steady, you just want to pay the standard rate, instead of which you've explained that if you team it with a battery, you can actually exploit time of use tariffs very to your advantage. So that's really fascinating. Thank you for that. So my sort of follow-up question on that then is, compared with the kind of solar plus battery installs, what sort of size of battery, or does that make any sense? Because it would depend on the size of the house. But I mean, I'm asking you partly because batteries are really quite expensive, the capital costs. So
yeah, so for most homes, I'm thinking about 3 to 4 bedroom homes, the job of the battery is mostly to get you through that super peak time, which is only 2 to 3 hours. Okay, and then your 5 kilowatt hours is typically more than enough on a mild winter day, like up to like 4 degrees. If it's colder than that, then battery will drain quite quickly. But of course, most of the winter is between 4 and 15 degrees, so kind of like averages it out really, really well. If you have an electric car, that's why just that holistic thinking is really important. And you're putting a lot of mileage onto your car in the morning. You're driving 50, 60 miles, for example, and want to make use of these cheap electricity tariffs. So you don't have the second recharge time during the day because you only have that kind of off-peak time once at night. We typically recommend a bigger battery so that you can kind of run it throughout the day. So it depends a little bit on your specific setup. But for most homes, a 5 kilowatt hour system is more than enough when you optimize for total cost of ownership, right?
yeah. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, good. Right, before we say thank you to Christoph, I'd just like to make one quick announcement. MEG has a series of talks. This is obviously one of them. We have a talk taking place on the 3rd of June. We haven't established what it's going to be yet, but please look out for it. We will have it sorted out hopefully in the next few weeks. So, can we thank first of all everybody for turning up? That's hugely appreciated. And much more importantly, Christoph, for a really interesting and informative talk. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Christoph.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for reaching out, John.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Really interesting.
Good. Thank you, everyone.
Have a great evening. Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheerio, everybody. Bye-bye.